We are going to be talking about modeling motion within and between linguistic realms. Now, I'm going to start off and focus primarily on this first part, on what we mean when we say modeling. Modeling here, we're talking about the activity that sociolinguists do to attempt to simplify or explain English language variation across the world. Now, there's been a lot of models that have been used over time. And this slide has just some of them, where the older ones on the left here, the map and branch model, wheel and spoke model, are very geographically linked, where this one is about the history of English languages branching off as it moved throughout the world. We have a slightly more pluricentric model in the wheel and spoke model, where we have a lot of different English language variations mapped more in their relationship to one another rather than relationship to history. And as the models became more contemporary, on the right here, they tend to get a little bit more abstract and also include the ability to map individual users, whereas the older models simply look at varieties as monolithic entities. And then with the most recent ones, actually moving away from the visual representation and going to a more of an economic or political science style of modeling, where you use an abstract system to describe the link between these different varieties. But having said all that, the one in the center I didn't mention is, of course, Braj-Kotru's three circles model. It's not even accurate to say it's the most commonly used one among language teachers, which is what we see ourselves, and I'm assuming many of us do here. I would argue that this is probably the only model that TESOL professionals use on a regular basis in presentations and in research projects. And that is a problem, because the model not only is questionable, where we have this is where we have the inner circle, the US, UK, the originators of the language in one category, distinguished from the second stage colonies like India, Singapore, Philippines, and then everyone else, including us here in Japan, Sweden, Korea, places like that, in this expanding circle. Now, the problem is that when TESOL professionals use this, it tends to be used as if this is an accurate definition of the way English is now and always will be. And in fact, that is not ever what Kotru intended it to be. It was designed as a sociolinguistic tool to help explain some links between these different varieties. And when you pick up a model like this one, or any other model, and you use it uncritically, you're picking up a lot of ideology with that too. Especially in this case, one of the biggest problems being this elevation of the inner circle to being the better or more correct or more accurate model. And that's a problem for teachers like us who don't see English in that way, who see English as a lingua franca, something that's used worldwide, and primarily not by those people, but most of the English use in the world is by people in the so-called outer and expanding circles. And so what we had done is we started to look at all of the models and kind of graphing them out in terms of how well they meet what we think are some kind of critical aspects of modeling. And I'm not going to go through all the details here, but we added kind of 6 major measurements, like are they anti-hegemonic, which the older models are certainly not. They promote the value and importance of inner circle English, or whatever they call it in their model. Only the newer models are dynamic, that is, can adapt to change over time. But as we know, English language use is rapidly changing in terms of how it is used, especially in a transnational context. Speaking of that, non-national varieties, most of the models don't have a way to account for versions of English like ASEAN English or international business English that aren't linked up to a single national entity. Only the newer models, again, can map individual users, which is important because not everyone from a given country speaks English the same way, even if they speak so-called American English or Singaporean English or what have you. The detail level varies, but really, again, the most important thing for us as language teachers is the model pedagogically actionable? That is, does it help teachers do something in their classrooms, as they plan their classrooms or conduct them, or as administrators or even government people, government officials kind of lay out a national curriculum? Is it helping them, or is it perhaps even leading them astray, like we would say that the Three Circles model does? And there, because of this, back in 2013, Chris Haswell developed what he called the global model of English, which he and I have subsequently worked together to revise and modify. Briefly, we've talked about this before, even at this conference, but on the surface here we have what might be called the world Englishes, the national varieties mapped kind of geographically. And users of English are also appear on this map, and they are pretty much always going to have some touchstone to this surface. But most users also expand into the middle, because most of us are able to speak to people who use other varieties of English to greater or lesser success. And that's where we have the outer core area. As you gain intercultural or international competence in English, you acquire the ability to make contact with other parts of the globe. In addition, this is the place where the model puts the non-national varieties, whether that's, again, like the ASEAN English that has its own separate rules distinct from the individual countries' rules, or even things like, say, online gaming English or Raplish, so pop culture Englishes that are, again, distinct. So throughout the outer core spreads all both users who are able to do this transcultural communication, as well as these international varieties. When we get to the center, the inner core, which we equate with the lingua franca English perspective, we have users in this space, but we don't have language varieties, because the inner core is not a set of rules. It's not a kind of English. Rather, it's an attitude towards the use of English that says the goal is communication with people, and it's going to be communication across boundaries and across varieties. And necessarily speaking, that's going to be difficult. It's going to require strategies to achieve this transcultural communication. It's going to require recasting and circumlocution and things like that. But really, especially, it requires the attitude that says, I'm not looking to be correct, and I'm not looking to my other speaker to be correct. I'm looking to find a way for us to communicate and accomplish whatever task it is we're about. And I said before, for us, kind of the most important thing is the model pedagogically actionable? And we think that keeping this model in mind helps distinguish between a more traditional kind of language teaching and a more lingua franca focused one. So in traditional language teaching, the kind you see in, say, a textbook that says, this textbook is UK English, or this textbook is American English, or in national policies, like Japan's policy, which essentially says that North American varieties of English are better targets. If you're teaching students that way, you're taking the students who are speaking Japanese English, and you're saying our goal is to move them, to make them mimic or copy the speakers of American English or British English. Well, the problem with that is that not only is that inefficient, right, that is traveling across the surface of the globe is the longest distance you can take to get somewhere, but it's also not actually opening you up to international communication. It's getting you to speak one individual variety. Rather, if you take a lingua franca approach and it says you want students to have this communicative ability, instead you're moving them towards the center, and they're expanding as they do that in the sense of getting access to a lot of different communication competencies. Especially once they can cross into that inner core, that is when they are going to be able to rapidly interact with people around the world because they have these strategies and this willingness to do so. So, but all that is still kind of abstract, and it's not actually what we do in the classroom. So this is where I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Haswell to kind of take us into a more practical approach.
Okay, so what I'm going to lead on now is basically, having seen all of this and having worked on it and published on it, still the question always comes back, so what? Okay, so all right, so we agree that this is what we want to do with our students, so what? What can we do about it? So this is the next stage that we wanted to go on to. And if we accept that this is what we want to aim to make our students more competent intercultural, transcultural communicators in a mutual foreign language, there are basically 4 levels of communication that can be observed. Minimal communication, or no communication, where the 2 parties can't actually do anything. Bilaterally negotiated communication, where both parties are intent on communicating and doing some form of a negotiated speech. Unilaterally negotiated speech, where one of the parties is having to do all or most of the work. And equal proficiency, competent communication, where very little change has to be made in either the vocabulary, the lexis, or the pronunciation, because they're equally competent in a variety of English. And to map this onto the model, we developed 7 observable moves, where the numbers are the number of zones being crossed, and the notation is the type of communication that's being achieved. And again, we're still in the kind of so what stage, so let's try and put them into the model so I can actually explain what they actually are. The 0x would be where 2 people using the same language, let's use English as the example here, but there's no communication possible because they are not changing anything of probably their pronunciation cues. We can all imagine 2 varieties of English where the pronunciation is so different and the 2 parties are unwilling to make any effort to change it, where no communication would be impossible. This is a clear lack of intent to communicate. A 0n, where they're both in the same zone, or a 0e, where they are negotiating. The 2 parties are trying. They have some intent to communicate. It might be like here at an international conference, where there's a mutual foreign language, but they're both trying to get the message across. And if they're highly competent, then this is probably likely to be even more successful. A 1n would be across 2 zones, where there's a proficient user of the language who is working with someone else who has the intent to communicate, but there's a difference in their proficiency. This could be a situation where students come from other countries and are having to take EMI courses, for example. The professor might be more highly competent, but the student is trying to make that communication possible. A 1U is where you're across 1 zone and only 1 person unilaterally is doing all of the work. So again, this could be, for example, a recent immigrant into a country, having to communicate with someone in a government office, get a driving license, get a permit for something. The person in the office is not helping out very much, and 1 person is having to do all of the work. A 2U, again, this is across 2 zones. A highly proficient user, let's say this is a tourist who has gone to another country, and either the person that they're talking to, their interlocutor, is trying to help them out to make this communication work, or is not, and this person is trying to get something from them. But either way, they're highly competent and they're able to cross 2 zones to make this communication work. So, as we said, we want to put this into a classroom. So how does this map onto our classroom work? Well, we hope this never happens. So we hope we don't have a situation where the students aren't trying at all. It could do, but let's just be positive for a moment. This is probably where most of our students are. Equal proficiency, willing to do something to make the communication work, but not having to negotiate very much. These are where our classroom activities come in, where depending on the proficiency or the relative proficiency of the students, we want them to be able to negotiate what they're saying. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about that. And so these might be the 4 types of interaction that we can observe in our classrooms right now. These are the interactions we want to prepare our students for when they leave the classroom, whether they're going overseas for study or for travel, where they might be in a situation where they are the only party with intent, and they have to keep going. So in these situations, not only are we teaching them how to negotiate their performance, but also we're trying to teach them to have patience and develop an intent to communicate, because if they don't have anything to achieve, why are they communicating in the first place? When we talk about negotiation, we wanted to see how we could put these into the classroom. And so we focused mainly on these 5 strategies. To paraphrase either what you have said or what someone else has said to check your understanding. To summarize, if you have a particularly long interaction, you might want to just give some of the main points at the end to help the person you're talking with. recasting completely, choosing different lexis or different grammar to try and work the situation. Circumlocution, where the conversation breaks down and you're having to try and work around the whole thing. Again, maintain that intent. And of course, the thing that's most interesting to me, gesture. So a possibility of increasing the amount of communication by doing this. So, how to do it? Well, this was my job to try and come up with classroom activities, and over the last few months I've been putting them into practice in my classrooms, not just working on just standard learning of English as a foreign language, but also this idea of trying to work these strategies into the lesson. Now, if we're dealing with equally competent people, it's often difficult to make them notice a difference in competence that requires them to do this type of negotiation. So one of the games I came up with was It's a Person Who, where I would give them jobs. Let's say, for example, a cabin attendant. They were allowed to tell their partners in their small groups what the jobs did, or how these people are usually viewed in their job, but they could not say cabin, they could not say attendant. So putting an arbitrary restraint on the types of things that they're allowed to do. So when they're in the group, let's say they're in a group of 3, 2 people would cover their eyes or not look at the screen, 1 person can look, put something really easy on there. The rule is, when someone in the group says the word, everyone finishes, and usually we do this in about 5 seconds. Okay? In a classroom, with a book, it's Chris, and they say teacher. So they're kind of in, all right? They know what they're doing at this point. So, 2 other people, close their eyes, next person comes up. This one, where they have no shared repertoire, and there's nothing that they can use in the classroom as a reference, this one takes them about 60 seconds to 90 seconds for anyone to get close to this one. So you're able to show them that because they're in a classroom, teachers are very available to them. But this, they might not have any experience of it outside of a TV show or a movie. They have to work harder to explain it. And the same goes for some of these, unless they're in the call out the boot, and then they just go us and engineer. I then bring up the idea that single words can cause a complete breakdown in communication. Any SWAT in the room know whose quote this is? I'll give you a bit more context. It's a nation, our polyglot boarding house. Anyone who says he's an American but something else also isn't American at all. We have room for but one language here, that's the English language. Any ideas, any Americans? I'll give you a hint, it's a president. Yes, Raj?
I was just saying I'm American, I don't know.
Oh. All right.
Steve Bannon.
Oh, it wasn't Steve Bannon. But
That would have been on my list of guesses.
yeah, Big Ted, all right, about over 100 years ago, so it's not a new thing. But given this context, I'll then ask them, do they know, can they pick out what this word is? So polyglot means, come on, Swatsies. Thank you, all right. So once they've picked that one out, I introduce the importance of saying, what do you mean? So a single word can cause a breakdown in communication. Just say, what do you mean? And then I'll give them some ridiculous words, just make them up, and put them into a context, and then make the other person say, what do you mean? Make them give more context. So I rarely have a chance to ask my question. Still, what do you mean? Come on, make it sense. And then, I mean the other students take up too much time with the teacher. Ah, you mean there's too many people in your class. And we go through this with spiffalding. We go through this with buying raggles. And also we go through this with someone in your family called your Gamzee. I give them, and each time take away more and more of the frame. Give them some nonsense words, although in my hometown of Sheffield, I think some of these actually do have a meaning. Clout actually does mean to be sweet. But just nonsense words where they have to make up the context for it, and then switch sheets with another group, and they have to try and explain it to them. There are other activities in relation to interjecting and asking people to summarize and things like that, but we're kind of running out of time. The final thing that I'd like to leave you with is I'm constantly trying to come up with new ways to make this actionable, which is to say create that arbitrary restraint, show students that sometimes it could be a single word, a phrasing that they have to get around sometimes and somehow, and sometimes they're the only one with the intent to do so. So keeping that patience, always trying to find a positive outcome is the way that we are trying to operationalize this model in the classroom. So, thank you very much.
Perfect, yeah, and for a Q&A, anyone, the floor is open. Yeah.
Thank you.
What kind of class do you teach this?
This is in, I teach it in 3 different ones. So we have a skill-based one, which is basically class discussion. I have a theme-based one, which I use the book by Erin Mayer, The Culture Map, where she's constantly looking at conversations across culture. So it's a way to put it in there. And I use it in my, I teach a business school class as well. So and anywhere I can get it in, even if it's just like a warm-up activity.
How much time do you spend?
It depends. In the skill discussion class, it could be half the class going through a series of activities. If it's in other classes, it might just be 5-minute warm-up. We killed the room, Aaron. Okay.
I am not in this field, but I am curious because, no, two questions just to set the context. What level of classes? I assume this is university?
Yes.
University level. For somebody who's not in this situation, have you seen any sort of opposition to this approach?
Do you want to take it on the theoretical side?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned before, the government policy pretends to be internationally focused. But if you look at a lot of the details, especially not the main policy documents, but the ancillary documents that are created in councils and things like that, they're very clearly focused on American English, or North American English, they might say. And so there is a move against this, because it's all based on the fundamental idea of certain people speak English correctly and others don't. So that tends to be the resistance.
Yeah, when you started using the make-up words, I could see where some surrounding members or policy could actually jump in and claim that it's not being done right, or some
Yeah, no. The pushback usually is when we're doing things like this is part of the work that I'm doing on a textbook as well, and I'm constantly trying to get it in because my background's in EFL, and my MA is in language teaching, and everyone else that I work with did applied linguistics. So just the teaching of English is sometimes anathema to the people that are putting the textbooks together, even the people who are supposed to be the experts in it. So yeah, I think there's always a resistance because momentum's going in a certain way. And we're not trying to push back against it. We want people to be proficient users, but we're trying to steer it into a more pluricentric and open rather than the phrase we used was deficiency models breeding deficient models. So when you're constantly saying this is not American or this is not British, then you are reinforcing a model of the language that isn't up to date.
Thank you.
So I was just wondering, have you used this only among Japanese students, or have you had the opportunity to try it out between Japanese and international students as well?
Both. A lot of these things, these negotiation strategies, come from work on negotiation in LFE and ELF literature, where they have been done in other countries. So this was basically where we got our inspiration to take this model in this direction. So there's a lot of good stuff on negotiation.
You know, and one thing I was going to add to that is one of the keys, at least for me, I've done a little bit of this, not as much as he has, because I don't have quite the same flexibility, but I think you do too. You tell the students that the purpose of this is for international communication purposes.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
it's not a big reveal. It's not magic. Like we're saying that this is how we view the language, and this is kind of how we like them to view it. But they're not deficient.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the case of negotiation skill, I mean that strikes me as a transferable skill to non-linguistic areas. Do you do any kind of role play to people with different interests, for example, a language dispute or a dispute about something, and they use the kind of, like you said, paraphrasing and repeating back what someone said to try and reach mutual understanding, and that's not to do with language, but just part of the negotiation skill as a skill.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking into our funding proposal that we're putting together for next year. It's about to try and build up a library of materials, video, audio, and written materials on exactly that kind of thing, utilizing highly proficient users and negotiation strategies between them, because we couldn't find anything that didn't have the label, UK English or American English on it. So that's part of what we're trying to build up. Yeah, because they are just useful anyway. Just have that mindset.
Yeah.
We're getting the stop sign, but thank you very much.
Hi, yeah, I'll take